information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Alasdair Macleod, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello, this is Alasdair Macleod on behalf of the Gold Money Foundation. And on the line from Scottsdale in Arizona, I'm very pleased to have Charles Goyette, who is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Dollar Meltdown, Surviving the Impending Currency Crisis with Gold, Oil and Other Unconventional Investments. And that Congressman Ron Paul called a must-read, and investor Peter Schiff describes as a sensible plan to protect your wealth. And his latest book is Red and Blue and Broke All Over, subtitled Restoring America's Free Economy. Charles is also the editor of the Freedom and Prosperity Letter, which is a monthly political and financial newsletter. And the newsletter includes bi-weekly podcasts. He has years of experience as a financial professional in the commodities, securities, currency and precious metals business. And he has also been a participant in political and financial debate, appearing on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC and CNBC, and so on and so forth. Welcome, Charles. It's very nice to have you on.
Alasdair, it is a great pleasure to be on your program. Thank you very much.
I understand, before we get going, that when I had a look at your bio on Wikipedia, that you were kicked off one radio station for being a peace-loving liberal. Is this true?
Yeah, it's a first time for everything. I made myself unwelcome in certain segments of America, large segments, I think hysterical segments of America, back in 2002 and 2003 with my opposition to the elective war in Iraq. It was an extraordinarily unpopular position to take in what is normally called right-wing talk radio in America, and the company for which I worked was a Texas corporation that had long ties to President Bush, the vice chairman of the company. In fact, is the fellow that made Bush a millionaire by buying Bush's baseball team. So here they had one of their preeminent talk show hosts on one of their flagship radio stations opposing the president in a way that nobody else in that industry, or at least on any of their stations, was doing, and they did not like it very much. And so I sabotaged my career.
Only in America. Anyway, what I would like to talk about is the situation in America. We are now so fed up, I think, recycling information on Europe that is quite refreshing to consider your problems rather than our problems. First of all, Charles, please tell me that there is something nice going on in America. Can you think of anything?
Well, I actually can think of one or two things. I suppose the thing that I find most helpful going on here is the awakening that the Ron Paul presidential campaign has had, at least in the minds of young people on college campuses and so on, people who are beginning to see through this the statism, the Keynesian economics of the Republicans and Democrats, who have begun to break away from this. Alasdair, in the 1980s, I talked with Ron Paul about creating a committee to abolish the Fed. And he was busy at the time, too busy to do anything, and I was too busy to do anything at the time, but it was in the 1980s, and it's a good thing that we didn't waste a lot of time on it because nobody would have cared. But today, there's an enormous awakening in the part of particularly the young people that they are being bamboozled, they're being burdened with debts for the rest of their lives, the prospects of them enjoying the living standard that the prior generation has had may be fleeting, and so they're awakening to this, and I think that is a good thing.
Well, yes, I think so too, because in a sense, I think what Ron Paul was doing was doing what we're trying to do, and that is educate people in in the benefits of sound money, in effect. And if you have a central bank that prints money at a drop of a hat, obviously that's hardly the route to sound money. Which brings me on to the Fed. And the Fed seems to think, despite all experiences, that it can manage the economy by varying interest rates and, just chucking money at the problem. What's your take on this, Charles?
Well, I think that they're beginning to understand, at least surreptitiously, and they're not talking about it, that they don't know what they're doing, and it's a great acknowledgement for them to make. I think there's a little bit of fear among people at the Fed that has not been present. Alasdair, I suppose, now 54, maybe 55 months into this downturn. The Fed has empowered the exploding of the debt, empowered the fiscal authorities with running up massive debts. They have created trillions of dollars buying the bad paper of the money center banks by buying the bad debt of the United States Treasury. And the idea that the Fed could have taken these actions, could have exploded the monetary base by a couple of $1 trillion, and that it will have no impact, that this can have been done without any consequences, is of course laughable in its absurdity. And I think they're beginning to understand that they have a problem and they don't know how to get out of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I've got quite a lot of sympathy for the central bankers. Not that I ever advocate central banking, far from it, but they are actually in a very, very deep hole. And given that their education is entirely neoclassical, either Keynesian or monetarism, they really just don't know where the hell to turn, it seems to me. But if you look at the broader picture, most of the money that is created in the economy is obviously created in the banking system by the expansion of bank credit. And my, if you like, understanding of what's happened in America since the financial crisis is that there has been a tendency for this bank credit to contract. And to some extent, the Fed is trying to replace that by expanding narrow money, if you like, cash money. Is that how you see it?
It's very much how I see it, and it puts us in a peculiar situation in which a recovery threatens to make things much, much worse. In other words, when the banking system begins to loan again, when commercial credit begins to grow, which you would think would make all the concerned parties pleased at a recovery, it threatens to unleash this monster of monetary creation that so far has been more or less sitting there idle. I've described it in the Dollar Meltdown, Alasdair, as like a race car at the starting line. And, it's all, it's all a lot of noise and so on as the engines rev. It's very, very loud, but nothing happens until the clutch is popped. And then all of a sudden, when the light turns green and the clutch is popped, the race cars take off in a big cloud of burning rubber and smoke and noise and so on and so forth. And that's where we are today. They've created this massive monetary base, and when commercial lending begins to get underway again, it represents a virtual tidal wave of as you've described it, of leveraged currency inflation through the banking system.
Yes, that's right. For the benefit of our listeners, most of this money at the moment is parked on the Fed's own balance sheet, as I understand it, in the form of reserves. Safest place for it, I suppose. But even so, there is no sign, I think, of this money going into the economy and being used positively. So the Fed still must be very, very concerned, and they've got themselves into a bit of a hole because if they were to do more quantitative easing, it could undermine the dollar quite significantly. And there is a lot of criticism. Everybody's watching for quantitative easing, and of course it's not happening. Yet, presumably they don't do more quantitative easing because of the implications for the dollar. Am I reading this correctly, Charles?
Yes, and today, in fact, the Fed has had a meeting in which today, as we speak, as we do this interview, in which they've decided to extend their Operation Twist rather than to do an overt quantitative easing. But my view is that they're basically monetizing debt virtually every day. I mean, Fed, China with $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury debt holdings is second to the Federal Reserve, which holds, as I recall now, about $1.6 trillion. The difference being that when China buys U.S. Treasury instruments, when China loans the government money, they do it with real money. They took real resources and real human labor, and they made real things that they sold to real people. They earned a profit on it, and they invest that money into our treasuries. When the Federal Reserve buys treasuries, and now at these extraordinary levels of $1.6 trillion, they are funding the government with money that they just created out of thin air that morning. And so this continues to go on. But as far as the massive, overt, in the open quantitative easing three that many on Wall Street had expected, it has not materialized for now, which underscores my thesis, I think, that there's a little bit of fear on the part of the Fed that all of these things that they have tried have been ineffective, that they have a tiger by the tail, and they simply don't know what to do.
Yeah, that's certainly the feeling I get. I was interested in your contrast between China actually putting in genuine savings into treasuries, and when the Fed doing it, actually printing money to do it. Put another way, I suppose, on the one hand, you've got genuine savings going into it, and on the other hand, you've got the destruction of savings, because printing money is just destroying savings. Surely this is not a way to getting any sustainable economic recovery going in the States. What's your view on this savings question?
Yes, of course, growth comes from savings. We listen in this country to a depressing extent to Republicans and Democrats alike, presidents alike who look no further than the next quarter and their next election prospects, that encourage Americans to spend, make the current numbers in the current quarter look good, consumer spending is good, without any realization that it's savings that creates prosperity, that nobody ever spent their way to prosperity, that it's savings that create prosperity. But this is the heritage of 75, 80 years of Republicans and Democrats and their Keynesian nonsense in this country. And so we have spent ourselves into a situation now in which there are only two roads, in my view, before Americans right now, and those two roads are: how will we manage the default? The debts are so massive, the visible debts of $16 trillion, but that's only a small part of the picture. The hidden debts, the iceberg portion of the iceberg that is below the waterline, that is invisible and threatens the crack up of the ship of the state, it can be estimated at, I think conservatively, at $120 trillion. They will never be paid. And so the question is, how will the state default on these debts? It will destroy the currency in either event, but it can default in a slow and very painful, grinding manner of a prolonged inflation that destroys not only the currency over a few years, but destroys all of the capital markets. It destroys the fabric of commercial trust that makes capitalism and prosperity work. They can do that, or we can have we can have a confrontation with reality in which we acknowledge that the debts cannot be paid. We can with the candid confrontation of reality, we can. It's amazing the dynamic of a free economy in the face of reality to restore itself, to right itself. And I cite examples of this in the book Red and Blue and Broke All Over. The Depression of 1920, my friend Tom Wood said nobody ever heard of the Depression of 1920 because the economy was allowed to be free of interference and to right itself immediately. Post-World War II in America was the same thing. The Keynesians said, you millions of men coming back, we have to have huge government jobs programs, deficit spending, so on and so forth. We had none of that. We cut federal spending by almost 2/3 over the course of a few years, and the economy boomed. And then, of course, there's the wonderful example of the German economic miracle after World War II, in which the government interference in the economy and prices and so on was abandoned, and Germany blossomed in a way that I wish that we could today. So the choices before Americans now are really whether we will have a candid confrontation with the nature of reality, or whether we will drag this thing out for years. Either way, the U.S. dollar is a broken and failed currency.
I think that's very interesting what you've just said. I mean, if I can go back to the 1921 recession, that was the time when soldiers were returning. There was no work for them. There was a very sharp recession, and they raised interest rates at that time to purge the economy of malinvestments. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to do. But what happened was that it actually got the thing turning round very, very quickly. And then you had a wonderfully healthy economy in the early 1920s. And if I remember correctly, not that I was there, but from what I've read, Calvin Coolidge, who was president at the time, said that if he had left a legacy, it was that he didn't interfere at all. And, that's such a contrast with the current situation. And you mentioned Germany as well. And that's one of the bees in my bonnet, because what the Germans have done post-war is they have not interfered with people's savings. And the result is that you have got the necessary capital for great depth, if you like, in manufacturing capability. And so I think your two examples there are absolutely spot on. Looking at the U.S. debt, you reckon there's about 120 trillion of on balance sheet and off balance sheet. That is a huge number. Now, I think I'm right in saying that quite a number of commentators believe that the way in which this can be handled is through financial repression. But financial repression might be able to deal with a sort of, the 16 trillion we've got, and, as long as the state and other muni debt doesn't fall over, and as long as government guarantees don't get called, without the net present value of future liabilities, which presumably makes a large part of that 120 trillion, financial repression can't deal with it, surely.
No. And you're right to suggest that there's much more than unfunded liabilities and to cite government guarantees. The Pew Research study came out the other day about all the promises made by state governments and local governments across the United States with respect to pension payments, pension for retired workers, and health care. And of course, there's a shortfall there that can be measured in $1 trillion plus, student loan guarantees. It goes on and on. All of these things are the result of the Republican and Democratic politics of the United States, in which politicians make promises to get elected. There is no cost to them in making the promises to college students that you borrow money from the bank and the bank will be happy to loan it to you no matter your prospects when you get out of school, because the federal government will guarantee that they will be paid back. There's no cost to the politicians to make those promises. They only get the applause and the approval of people that avail themselves of those loans. And of course, the school administrators, the education bureaucracy approves it too, because it fattens their wallets. But eventually there's a day of reckoning for all of these sorts of promises. And so we have trillions in guarantees in real estate guarantees, pension guarantees, bank guarantees, education loan guarantees, retirement guarantees that we're not even really considering when we talk about $120 trillion in hidden debt. This is the end of the monetary system in the United States, and I've tried to explain it in a way that makes it accessible to people who have never thought about monetary issues, and indeed most Americans simply have it. And so I thought the best I could do to make it accessible to everybody is tell it in the tale of a childhood story that everybody will know. And it's the story, Alasdair, of the Three Little Pigs, a story that everybody knows. But in this case, it's told in reverse, and it has a moral to the story. And originally, the American people lived in a solid house that was like a brick house. It was made of gold. It was a gold standard, solid brick house that they liked very much. And the state authorities came and said, you will have to vacate this house. We want those gold bricks. We're going to take those gold bricks. And if you don't turn them over to us here in the early 1930s, you can be fined $10,000 and you risk 10,000 or 10 years in jail. And so
10 years in jail, yeah.
The American people fled from the solid brick house of gold, the gold standard that they liked, and they fled into what they were promised would actually be better, but it was a house of sticks, and it was a dollar exchange standard that prevailed until 1971, and then the winds of economic reckoning started blowing, and a reality settled in, and that began to collapse on itself, and so the American people were chased then into the dollar reserve standard that is blowing apart now. It's like a house of straw that is being scattered to the four winds. And some in America are beginning to understand this, thanks not only to our economic plight, but to the efforts of people like yourselves, like Congressman Paul and others, and they're beginning to grow nostalgic for that good, solid brick house. But I try to warn them. I think this is the most important warning out of this, because the people can be easily bamboozled again. It was not so long ago that the then head of the World Bank, Robert Zoellick, said, well, we need to get gold back into the monetary system. We need somehow to index the monetary system with gold. But I like to caution people that if it's not a real gold standard in which you own physical gold that you can take in your possession at any time you want, if it's not real gold but an indexing scheme, it's just another house. In fact, this would be a house of paper then that they've created, but they paint it to look like gold. But it is not a real gold standard. And in fact, a house of paper is even flimsier than a house of straw or a house of sticks. But this is what is probably in the offing for the American people.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting and good analogy insofar as I think it explains it very, very simply. So we now have the situation where it looks like there are big storms for the dollar itself. Can the dollar survive this, do you think? I mean, there's nothing in the dollar. It's just paper. It is the full faith of the U.S. government, which is being increasingly questioned. One wonders, what is the future for the dollar? How do you see it?
The future is it may survive in some form, but it will certainly not be anybody's favorite currency any longer. It is a currency that is being hollowed out before our very eyes. The pace will accelerate, and I have warned my readers to use the European debt crisis as an object lesson, so that they can as they watch this sovereign debt crisis unfold in Europe, they can apply the lessons to the United States. And I think there are three takeaways from it. First of all, the problem is always bigger, as it is in the United States, much bigger than the conventional wisdom acknowledges. You have boneheaded calls. Ben Bernanke told us the subprime crisis was over in 2007. Moody's Investor Services said a couple of years ago, 2.5 or 4 years ago, that anybody was concerned that the Greek government may be exposed to a liquidity crisis was misunderstood the situation. All of these things, conventional wisdom never acknowledges the depth of the problem. That is a lesson from the European travails that applies to us in the United States. Secondly, the solutions that are advanced by the governing classes are inadequate to this problem, and we have been through this drama in Europe of the European Central Bank and Greece and Spain, and so has been going on for years now. And they trot out one solution after another. None of them are adequate. The news media breathlessly. My local newspaper here in Arizona this morning had a headline from the G20 that somehow some new solution to calm the European currency waters was in the offing. We have been reading headlines like this for years. The mainstream media misreports this stuff. There is never any there. Sometimes these reports, I remember a report that the 15 European nations were going to provide the banks with liquidity to solve this problem 3.5 years ago that ran the Dow up 936 points in one day. And, of course, all that gain was given up soon. So the lesson should be learned by the American people. They should watch this because the sovereign debt crisis here in the United States can explode before them. Explode at a speed that nobody is reckoning. The mainstream media will not tell the people what is going on, perhaps because they don't know, and the governing classes are inadequate to the problem, and the only thing people can do is provide some protection from themselves by insulating themselves from the calamity of the U.S. dollar, and the only way to really do that is precious metals, gold, and silver as well. Yeah,
no, I think that's right. And I'm interested that you can use the European experience as an object lesson. I think the only difference between the two is perhaps one which isn't all that favourable as far as the dollar is concerned, and that is that your government, or rather its agent, the Federal Reserve Board, are free to trash the currency as a short-term solution to any problem, real or imagined, whereas the Europeans don't actually have that facility because the ECB is a separate entity. It's responsible to the politicians, obviously, because at the end of the day, every central bank is, but it's not responsible to any particular little group of politicians like the Greeks or the Spanish or the Italians. But Charles, this has been a fascinating interview, and I'm very, very grateful that you took time out to speak to us. And where can our listeners find you on the internet? Where do we find the Freedom and Prosperity Letter? Do you just Google it, or is there a website?
Probably the best place to go is to charlesgoyette.com, and you'll be forwarded immediately to my new book and a link as well for the Freedom and Prosperity Letter. If you'll go to charlesgoyette.com, that's spelled Goyette, charlesgoyette.com. By the way, Alasdair, I have to tell you my great respect for your organization, not only the foundation, but Gold Money as well. I see a real threat to all of our prosperity and livelihoods in the offing, having to do with the collapse of the payments system. Nothing happens if there is not a payment system, a viable payment system in place. And, the destruction of a currency is sand in the gears of commerce that makes reliable, particularly in the presence of the legal tender laws that we have in the United States. All of this threatens to bring commerce to a halt at enormous cost to our prosperity. And it's Gold Money provides a wonderful solution to this threat to the payment system.
Yes, I think a lot of people who have used the Gold Money facility are worried precisely about that point. Going down this route, unless something changes, there is a distinct possibility that when you go to use the ATM one day, nothing will come out of it. And, at that point, I think ownership of precious metals, which you referred to earlier, is something that you'll heave a sigh of relief that you actually decided to take out a little insurance. Anyway, Charles, that was really great, and thank you very much indeed. And, perhaps we can do this again in the not-too-distant future.
Well, I certainly hope so, Alasdair. I thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. Put time on it because nobody would have cared. But today, there's an enormous awakening in the part of particularly the young people that they are being bamboozled. They're being burdened with debts for the rest of their lives. The prospects of them enjoying the living standard that the prior generation has had may be fleeting. And so they're awakening to this, and I think that is a good thing.
Well, yes, I think so too, because in a sense, I think what Ron Paul was doing was doing what we're trying to do, and that is educate people in the benefits of sound money, in effect. And if you have a central bank that prints money at a drop of a hat, obviously that's hardly the route to sound money. Which brings me on to the Fed. And the Fed seems to think, despite all experiences, that it can manage the economy by varying interest rates. The
information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Podcast with Alasdair Macleod, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Hello, this is Alasdair Macleod on behalf of the Gold Money Foundation. And on the line from Scottsdale in Arizona, I'm very pleased to have Charles Goyette, who is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Dollar Meltdown, Surviving the Impending Currency Crisis with Gold, Oil and Other Unconventional Investments. And that Congressman Ron Paul called a must-read, and investor Peter Schiff describes as a sensible plan to protect your wealth. And his latest book is Red and Blue and Broke All Over, subtitled Restoring We are now so fed up, I think, recycling information on Europe that is quite refreshing to consider your problems rather than our problems. First of all, Charles, please tell me that there is something nice going on in America. Can you think of anything?
Well, I actually can think of one or two things. I suppose the thing that I find most helpful going on here is the awakening that the Ron Paul presidential campaign has had, at least in the minds of young people on college campuses and so on, people who are beginning to see through this the statism, the Keynesian economics of the Republicans and Democrats, who have begun to break away from this. Alasdair, in the 1980s, I talked with Ron Paul about creating a committee to abolish the Fed. And he was busy at the time, too busy to do anything, and I was too busy to do anything at the time, but it was in the 1980s, and it's a good thing that we didn't waste a lot of them in certain segments of America, large segments, I think hysterical segments of America, back in 2002 and 2003, with my opposition to the elective war in Iraq. It was an extraordinarily unpopular position to take in what is normally called right-wing talk radio in America, and the company for which I worked was a Texas corporation that had long ties to President Bush. The vice chairman of the company, in fact, is the fellow that made Bush a millionaire by buying Bush's baseball team. So here they had one of their preeminent talk show hosts on one of their flagship radio stations opposing the president in a way that nobody else in that industry, or at least on any of their stations, was doing, and they did not like it very much. And so I sabotaged my career.
Only in America. Anyway, what I would like to talk about is the situation in America, America's free economy. Charles is also the editor of the Freedom and Prosperity Letter, which is a monthly political and financial newsletter. And the newsletter includes bi-weekly podcasts. He has years of experience as a financial professional in the commodities, securities, currency, and precious metals business. And he has also been a participant in political and financial debate, appearing on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and CNBC, and so on and so forth. Welcome, Charles. It's very nice to have you on.
Alasdair, it is a great pleasure to be on your program. Thank you very much.
I understand, before we get going, that when I had a look at your bio on Wikipedia, that you were kicked off one radio station for being a peace-loving liberal. Is this true?
It's a first time for everything. I made myself unwelcome